And we're going to start with an example of controls performance. And I think most folks who are familiar with ServiceNow recognize that there's a lot of capability that lives on the platform today, from vulnerability management, security incident response, to change management, and some of our operations, asset management, business management areas. As Kathleen mentioned before, one of the great things about ServiceNow is the vast network of partners. One of those is ClearSky, and what they have here is a built-on now identity platform that allows you to bring all those identity and access controls on platform, allow you to perform those in the system, which in turn can help with some of the continuous performance and continuous monitoring objectives. For today's discussion, we're going to be focusing on a user access review scenario. And so this is just one dashboard that's helping us understand what's going on in terms of the different reviews that are going on, those that are completed, waiting for approval, review in progress, as well as some of our top reviewers, who are the folks who are getting a lot of the requests to go and review access. We're going to be looking at an example here where we're going to review the admin access for ServiceNow using this user access review process. This can be integrated with Active Directory and a number of other systems outside of ServiceNow, but can also be used to help manage the access on the platform. We do this by setting up review templates, and these review templates help us understand, what are we looking at? Are we looking at accounts, entitlements? Which accounts are we looking at? So we can filter to only certain folks within geographic regions, sitting in certain facilities who have certain job titles. And then we can start looking at the different types of access. In this example, we're looking for active employees or active accounts who have the admin role within ServiceNow. We can then set up how are we going to perform this review. And we're doing a contextual review, and that really means we're looking at the account owner's manager. So we're going to go to the manager and ask them to review this access. If for one reason or another the owner manager is not available or not populated, it will default to J in our example. Last piece here is around the scheduling, and this is where we start to get into some of that continuous performance activities. So not only do we have the capability to find efficiencies in the way we perform these user access reviews, we can set these to be performed on a set interval. So we could look to perform these every 30 days, 60, 90, once a year, depending on the type of access we are reviewing. So once these are set up and we've built out that schedule, these will create new campaigns automatically, and gets us into the the game of not remembering to go and perform these campaigns, but rather going executing them. So we'll get notifications and emails when it's time to go out and perform these reviews. I've gone ahead and created a review, and this is, again, that ServiceNow admin review. And this is where we start to go and look at each individual user and determine whether they should continue to have that access. I am one of the reviewers here, and I have a handful of individuals that I need to go and perform this. Just to quickly touch on some of the usability, we're able to include guidance for the managers, for that first line folks who need to understand, what is this? How do I complete this review? And some tips to getting through it in a timely fashion. And then it's just a matter of working through each of these individually. When I click into a user, Ron Kettering in this example, we're looking at that admin role, and we determine, does Ron need to keep this access? And we can either flag it green, keep, or red, disable. And based on this decision, we can trigger the follow-on actions, either automatically deprovisioning that access or triggering tasks to the necessary application teams or help desk teams to take that action. So just another example of some of the continuous controls monitoring, because this is now automated. We're making sure we're engaging the right teams. We're making sure these controls are being performed in a timely fashion. So as we're going through this, we can start to understand, well, are these controls being performed? Are they being performed well in a timely fashion? And that really gets into controls monitoring. You'll start looking at this dashboard here, and this one's showing us, our compliance as an organization. We've identified that there's nearly 25,000 different controls that need to be applied across all of our different applications, our products, our services, different functions. And we can also see, how do we stand? And I think most folks can realize that this is a very daunting number of controls that we potentially want to monitor. Well, traditionally that would involve, what Kathleen outlined earlier, documenting the controls, doing design reviews, going out requesting evidence, reviewing that evidence, and determining, is this in line with expectations. And so when we kind of expand beyond that SOC scope, we end up with quite a large number of controls that need to be considered. The example we're going to dig in today is a change control process. So leveraging ServiceNow's change management capabilities. All this functionality lives on platform today. This one here is specifically looking for SAP Financial Accounting, one of our key applications that has SOX implications. And we can see it's here in this compliance stage. We're also in monitor. We've gone through, we've performed attestations, we reviewed the control and made sure it's appropriate. And now we just want to know if the control is being performed as intended. And we can start to monitor this using what ServiceNow calls indicators. And these are on-platform versions of the traditional key risk, key performance indicators that most of us are familiar with the added benefit of automating this process. So we can say, well, we want to look at some of the technical review that occurs for changes. We want to look at system change control procedures. And we can see here that these indicators that have been defined have all passed recently. Well, what does that mean? How do we determine that? When we look at the indicator, we can see that it is linked to our application, SAP Financial Accounting. It's linked to the relevant control. And then we have a method in terms of how we're going to go out and determine the results. And so this one here is looking at data from our change request table. We're taking a sample size of 50. So this is an area where there may be a lot of data for the source system or for the process in general, and we need to make sure that we're taking a representative sample. And so this one here is set at a 50 record sample size. So when ServiceNow goes and runs this indicator, it's actually going to gather those 50 records for your review after the fact. We're also able to set up kind of, what sort of criteria are we looking for within the data, and how frequently do we want to run this indicator. This one here is being set up to look at it quarterly. So we'll look at that once a quarter to determine, is the change process being followed. The nice thing is we can define indicator templates. So this is the high level of saying any application that we want to look at for change control process, this is how we can build that out. We can also get very detailed in the way that we build this out. We can take a scripted approach where we are really evaluating that data in a very precise way. So we can really do some deep analysis on that data if necessary. We can also leverage the kind of supporting data and the filters that we defined earlier. Ultimately, the goal is to be able to know when there are problems. If this indicator runs and finds that the change control process is not being followed as intended, that we had maybe an emergency change that was put in without approval, well, let's create an issue for this. Let's really make sure that we understand that there was a problem. Let's identify what sort of remediation steps need to occur so that we can ensure that we fix the process and that this doesn't happen. This obviously was an example in the change management space, but this would be applicable for user access reviews. This would be applicable for vulnerability response, security incident response, or any of the other kind of first line processes that we have within ServiceNow. Maybe one last note before I hand it over to Giovanni would be that we can leverage data off platform as well. So there's obviously an advantage to having that data on platform, but if that's data lives elsewhere, we can look at pulling that in through integration so that we can get similar monitoring capabilities for all of the different areas of your business. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Giovanni, who's going to walk us through the evidence warehouse approach. Really, how can we manage these assurance obligations for areas where the data maybe is not readily available. It's not something that we can leverage continuous monitoring for presently.
Definitely. Thanks, Jay. So this is Giovanni Sparacio speaking. Pleasure to be here with you all today. So what I've done here is I've pulled up our evidence warehouse application in ServiceNow, and this is our overview dashboard that you're seeing. So I'll share a bit of the background on the genesis of evidence warehouse. And basically, we've worked with many clients that have multiple siloed functions, oftentimes requesting the same artifacts from the same business owners time and time again. So this is getting into that idea of audit fatigue. So for instance, you might have experienced your internal or external audit functions, or even internal teams like privacy teams or security teams, all effectively asking the same control owners for the same information. So our answer to this problem was to develop what we've called the evidence warehouse. And what's happening on our Built On Now application is that clients who want to be able to assess once, test once, and satisfy many are now equipped with the platform to be able to do so. So within the evidence warehouse here, we have this concept of evidence boxes, and applied to an evidence box is this high-level process that you're seeing along the top. Think of it as a workflow. And so this workflow begins in the draft phase. And this is an empty state where we're defining what the purpose of the box is. How does it relate to the organization? Is it for a particular process or function, or even a facility? Or how does it link to the different controls or regulatory mandates that are informing our program? And effectively, what we're defining here is the evidence box, how it fits in the broader context of the organization, and then what exactly do we want to gather from an evidence or artifact standpoint to support various assurance activities. So as part of this draft stage, this is where we define who's going to gather the evidence. It could be a named individual, it could be a group of individuals. And once we've defined who that is, we can go ahead and send them tasks. And that's what happens in the collection stage of the workflow. So these tasks are sent out. It gives an expected start and end date for the individuals to go collect the requested evidence. And then it's actually gathered from those first line personnel, first line of defense. So once that evidence has been provided, the workflow is going to advance to this review bucket here, where we're confirming that the evidence provided meets what was actually requested. So if we ask for a policy or standard, for example, we're going to want to make sure we received a governance document. If we asked for screenshots or configuration files, we're going to want to make sure it's what we had originally asked for. And an important thing to note on this stage in the process is that we want to reserve judgment on whether a control is being satisfied when testing is actually being performed. Said differently, this step is really focused on confirming that the evidence supplied meets what was actually requested from that assurance perspective. And then once the review is complete, it advances to this prepared stage in the workflow. And at this point, we're able to link that evidence box that has evidence to different control tests or engagements or audit tests within the system. And when it's linked to a particular engagement, that's when it advances to the supplied stage. And the main difference here is that the supplied state is when the evidence box is being used as evidentiary support to support a particular test or audit. So at this point in time, we would no longer want to be making edits to the content of that box. So we've built the logic into this application where we can lock down the record at that point in time. It becomes read-only, and we can no longer add, remove, or delete files. So the last piece here, this archive stage in the workflow, this is about time bounding these boxes. So we could say this box is valid through the end of the quarter or through the end of the calendar or fiscal year, at which point it would be archived and maintained for historical or document retention purposes. And in addition to archiving these boxes, we can also schedule recollection of evidence. And this is where we get into some of those more tactical, proactive assurance techniques, where if there's a manual process that needs to occur on a fixed frequency, say every 6 or 12 months, we need to go into the system and do something, then how about we request that evidence in line with the control performance frequency? So those first line of defense personnel are actually getting those reminders to go perform their control. They're gathering the evidence right then and there, and then it's being submitted through this automation enabled workflow that enables you to review the evidence and ensure that it could satisfy the current request as well as any other future audit requests. So what we want to do here is avoid being 3 months down the road, realizing, we didn't perform a certain time-based control. And at this point, there's not much that can be done to remediate that situation. Sure, you could perform the control, but that gap still would have existed for, 3 months. So our evidence warehouse provides an additional mechanism and layer to help steer clear from those situations. So that's the high-level process flow that you're seeing here. I'll pause, see if Brian, David, or Jay have anything to add. And if not, we can actually go look at an evidence box. Sounds good.
Fantastic.
All right, so here we have an inventory of evidence boxes. And you'll note these can be used for both IT and business controls. So whether it's a SOX use case or a non-SOX use case, it works for both. So you'll see a couple examples here. We have a monthly account reconciliation control for your balance sheet. We have a quarterly password configuration setting review control evidence box here for those SOC sensitive systems, for example, that require that quarterly attestation and documentation of controls. So we'll focus on this quarterly password configuration setting control evidence box for now. And when we launch it, you'll see we have the name of the evidence box. We've indicated that Abel and Don, the control owners, are going to be the collectors of this evidence and will be responsible for submitting it. You'll note that we've required this needs a review. And then we've also got this widget here for enabling auditor access. So we have roles and access control that can allow external regulators or other parties to come in and see these documents as well. So that's another mechanism to alleviate that audit fatigue that we oftentimes see. And then down here in the review tab, we've indicated that Beth Anglin will be the reviewer for the evidence that's ultimately submitted by these control owners. So as I scroll down, you'll see that this evidence is set to recollect. So we have the ability to define that frequency. We have the quarterly frequency here, and then we get this suggested date that's mid Q4 when we're going to want to go do that again as the year comes to a close. And we also have this archival functionality that we talked about. So for instance, we could set it for year end just before that roll forward period to close out an annual audit. And then that's when we lock this evidence box down for Q3 evidence that we're talking about. So I'll come down here, you'll see some menus here. We have collection tasks. So the classic example here is you're going to want that control owner approval for those password configuration settings, and you're going to want the actual evidence with that timestamp for audit documentation purposes. So these are enumerated here where you can go in, you can go in, we see a description for this task to provide evidence that demonstrates the Active Directory password configuration setting review is actually occurring and being approved and signed off and saying, hey, this meets what's stipulated in our IT security policies. So as an example, I'll go in here, choose an attachment, and we'll put the review and approval in there. It'll upload, and you can see that we now have attachments here. So as I back out into the evidence box, we have the ability to see, sorry, excuse me,